It happened on a Tuesday at 10:17 a.m., according to the timestamp on the calendar invite. Quick sync, it said. I walked into the small conference room on the third floor with my laptop tucked under my arm, already open to the spreadsheet I'd been staring at since 7:30. The numbers were still wrong. They hadn't changed overnight. They hadn't changed after I refreshed the CRM twice, after I pulled the deal history, after I matched invoice numbers against the payout report. The commission line where my name should have been was empty. The amount, $14,860, sat under my manager's initials. HR was already there. Megan from People Ops sat closest to the door with a legal pad and a pen that clicked when she shifted her grip. My manager, Dan, leaned back in his chair, one ankle on his knee, scrolling on his phone. No one looked surprised to see me. I sat down and put my laptop on the table, angled so they could see. The room smelled like burnt coffee. The blinds were half closed, cutting the sun into horizontal stripes across the table. Thanks for joining, Megan said. We just want to talk through a concern. I think there's been a mistake, I said. I kept my voice level. The Acorn account closed on the 28th. I originated the deal. The commission posted this morning under Dan's name. Dan didn't look up. Megan glanced at him, then back at me. Let's slow down, she said. We want to keep this productive. I clicked to the CRM timeline and turned the laptop a little more. Here's the activity log. First contact is me. Discovery call, proposal, pricing approval, contract sent. Dan joined one call after the terms were agreed. Dan sighed and finally put his phone down. I oversaw the deal, he said. I brought it across the line, I said. I felt my face get warm. I closed it. Megan raised her hand slightly, like a traffic cop. Okay, let's be mindful of our tone. My tone? I said. I'm pointing to dates. She wrote something on the pad. The pen clicked again. We're not here to debate facts in an emotional way. I'm not emotional, I said. I'm confused. This is my commission. Dan leaned forward now. We talked about this, he said. Leadership involvement changes attribution. We did not talk about that, I said. There's a policy. It says origination determines payout unless reassigned in writing. I was never reassigned. I pulled up the policy and scrolled to the paragraph. Megan leaned in to read. Dan crossed his arms. Megan straightened. Policies allow for managerial discretion, she said, especially when there's coaching involved. There was no coaching, I said. You joined one call to approve a discount. I asked for approval in Slack. You said approved. That's it. Dan's jaw tightened. You're being very confrontational. I looked at Megan. Can we please focus on the numbers? She inhaled, slow and loud. We need to reset, she said. This conversation is getting heated. It wasn't. My voice hadn't changed. I was sitting back in my chair, hands flat on the table. I could hear my own breathing. I could hear the hum of the HVAC. I'm asking for my commission, I said. Megan closed her notebook. What I'm hearing is that you're upset about a compensation decision. I'm not upset, I said. I'm stating that my manager took credit for my deal. Dan laughed once, short. That's not appropriate language. Megan nodded. I'm going to ask you to be quiet for a moment. The words landed oddly, like they didn't belong in a workplace. Be quiet? Yes, she said. Let me finish. I stopped talking. Dan looked satisfied, like a switch had been flipped in his favor. Megan continued. We value transparency and respect. Accusations like stole aren't constructive. I didn't say stole, I said. She looked down at her pad. Earlier you implied wrongdoing. I said the commission is under his name. Dan leaned back again. This is exactly what I mean. Megan met my eyes. We're going to document this as a disagreement over attribution. At this time, the payout will remain as processed. I stared at her. So that's it? We can revisit next quarter, she said. For now, I need you to lower your voice and accept the decision. My voice is normal, I said. She pressed her lips together. Please be quiet. There it was, again. Not let me speak, not hold on. Be quiet, like I was a child in a hallway. I closed my laptop slowly. The click echoed in the room. I don't accept this, I said. I did the work. Dan checked his watch. We're done here. Megan stood, signaling the end. I'll send a summary email. I stood too. My hands were shaking just a little. I noticed because I had to steady them to pick up my laptop. As I reached the door, Megan added, and for future reference, bringing spreadsheets into meetings like this can escalate things. I turned back. They're the only reason we're here. She didn't respond. Back at my desk, I pulled up my inbox. At 10:42 a.m., her email arrived. Subject, summary, compensation discussion. It said the commission was awarded based on managerial involvement and that I was advised to maintain professionalism. It did not mention dates, policies, or numbers. It did not mention that she told me to be quiet. I forwarded it to my personal email and sat there, staring at the empty commission line on the report, listening to Dan laugh with someone down the aisle. I'd been at the company just over 3 years when that meeting happened, long enough to know how things usually worked, long enough that people stopped explaining processes to me, long enough that my name showed up on known internal leaderboards without anyone commenting on it anymore. I worked in enterprise sales, mid-market accounts that took months to close and a lot of follow-up. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid well when it worked. Commission was the whole point. Dan became my manager about 8 months earlier, after my previous manager left abruptly for personal reasons. Dan had been a top performer once, years ago, before moving into management. He talked about those days a lot. He liked to tell stories about closing deals on legal pads and shaking hands in parking lots. He also liked to remind us that he was on our side, which he said often enough that it started to sound defensive. At first, I didn't mind him. He was hands-off in a way that felt like trust. Our one-on-ones were short. He asked about pipeline, asked if I needed help, then talked about his calendar being packed with meetings. I didn't push for more. I didn't need much from him. I was closing consistently. The Acorn deal wasn't supposed to be special. It was a manufacturing company based in Ohio, around 400 employees, looking to consolidate vendors before the end of their fiscal year. I got the lead through an inbound form, followed up the same day, and ran the discovery call myself. Procurement was slow, legal asked predictable questions, and finance pushed back on pricing exactly once. It was clean, boring even. I looped Dan in when the discount approval came up because anything over 10% needed sign-off. I sent him a Slack message with the breakdown. He replied with a thumbs-up emoji and approved. That was the extent of his involvement until the final call, when he joined for 15 minutes, mostly silent, camera off. Afterward, he sent me a message. Nice job. That's why the payout report stopped me cold. There was no gray area, it wasn't a joint deal, it wasn't reassigned, there was no email, no conversation, nothing that suggested the credit would change. HR, officially, People Ops, sat on the 4th floor. Megan had been there longer than most people. She liked to frame everything in terms of culture. In onboarding, she talked about psychological safety and open doors. She was the one who told us HR was here for you, not just the company. I'd never had a reason to doubt that before. Before Dan, I reported to Sarah, who was meticulous about attribution. She drilled into us that commission disputes were serious and documented everything. When she left, there was a brief period where the team reported directly to a director, and during that time, payouts were delayed but accurate. No one touched anyone else's deals. My relationship with Dan had shifted subtly over the last few months, though I didn't recognize it at the time. He started joining more calls, often last minute. He'd asked to be looped into emails for visibility. Once he introduced himself to a prospect as leading the account, even though I'd been working it for weeks. I told myself it was just his style. Outside of work, my life was stable in a quiet way. I rented a 1-bedroom apartment 15 minutes from the office. My lease was up in 6 months, and I was saving to move closer to my sister. That commission would have covered the difference in rent for a year. I'd already mentally allocated it, half to savings, half to paying down a credit card I'd been carrying since a medical bill the year before. After the HR meeting, I tried to retrace everything objectively. I pulled old Slack messages, email threads, calendar invites. I wanted to see if I'd missed something, some casual comment that could be twisted into approval. There was nothing. The paper trail was clean. I talked to a coworker, James, later that afternoon. We grabbed coffee downstairs, standing because all the tables were full. I told him what happened, keeping my voice low, choosing my words carefully. That's messed up, he said immediately. That was your deal. I know. Has Dan done that before? I hesitated. Not to me. James nodded slowly. I heard something similar from Laura last quarter. Smaller amount, though. She didn't push it. Why not? He shrugged. Didn't want to rock the boat. That phrase stuck with me. Rock the boat, as if the boat wasn't already drifting. I sent Dan a message asking to talk one-on-one. He replied an hour later, let's connect next week. No explanation. That night, I went home and opened my personal laptop. I logged into the company portal and downloaded every commission statement I could access. I didn't know what I was planning to do with them. I just knew I wanted copies somewhere they couldn't disappear. I also reread the employee handbook. The commission policy was clear, but vague in the way policies often are. There was language about managerial discretion, but also about fairness and documentation. It didn't say a manager could keyhole. Simply, take a deal. The next morning, Megan's calendar showed open office hours. I considered going up there unannounced, then didn't. The memory of her telling me to be quiet sat heavy in my chest. It wasn't just the money. It was the way the conversation had been framed, the way my insistence on facts had been treated as a behavioral issue. At 9:03 a.m., Dan posted in the team Slack channel congratulating himself for closing Acorn. He tagged leadership and added a clapping emoji. No one corrected him. A few people reacted with thumbs up. I stared at the message longer than I should have. Then I took a screenshot. By the end of that week, I had a folder on my desktop labeled with the account name. Inside were emails, screenshots, policies, and the payout report. It felt excessive, almost paranoid. But it also felt necessary. Something had shifted. The job I thought I understood no longer felt solid. The rules I believed in had bent without warning, and the people who were supposed to straighten them had instead told me to lower my voice. I hadn't decided what to do yet. I just knew I wasn't going to forget it. The first clear sign something was wrong came the following Monday during my one-on-one with Dan. It was scheduled for 10:30, but he joined at 10:42 without acknowledging the delay. His camera stayed off. Mine was on, mostly out of habit. I could see my own face in the corner of the screen, neutral, waiting. So, he said, I hear you're still hung up on Acorn. I'm not hung up, I said. I'm trying to understand why my commission was reassigned without notice. He paused, just long enough for it to feel intentional. That kind of language is exactly the issue. What language? Reassigned, taken. It implies intent. I took a breath. Intent doesn't change the outcome, he sighed. This is what I'm talking about. You're very rigid. I followed the process. And leadership followed. Theirs, he said. Sometimes you have to zoom out. There it was. Zoom out. Another phrase that meant nothing but sounded like perspective. He leaned back in his chair, still off camera. I could hear typing. Maybe emails. Maybe Slack. Megan mentioned you brought spreadsheets into the HR meeting, he added. That escalated things. I brought documentation. Same difference, he said. It can come across as aggressive. I felt my jaw tighten. I wasn't aggressive. I'm just giving feedback, he said quickly. You should take it. There was a shift in his tone then, subtle but clear. This wasn't a discussion anymore. It was a correction. Look, he continued, I'm concerned about how this reflects on you. Leadership watches how people handle disappointment. I'm not disappointed, I said. I'm concerned about fairness. He laughed softly. Fairness is subjective. I stared at the screen. Commission isn't. Everything is, he said, especially at our level. Our level, as if we were peers in this, as if he hadn't just signed off on taking money from me. I want to be very clear, he said. Continuing to push this could hurt your growth here. There it was. Not a threat, exactly, just a suggestion, wrapped in concern. So you're saying if I keep asking about my commission, that's a problem? I'm saying perception matters, he replied, and right now the perception is that you're struggling with alignment. Alignment. Another word added to the pile. I nodded slowly, even though he couldn't see it. What would alignment look like to you? Dropping it, he said without hesitation, refocusing on pipeline, showing resilience. I didn't respond right away. My hands were folded in my lap, fingers pressed together. I could feel my pulse in my wrists. Okay, I said finally. And going forward? He perked up slightly. What do you mean? How do I protect my work? If I originate a deal, how do I make sure attribution is clear? He paused again. You need to collaborate more. I already do. With me, he said. Loop me in earlier. Let me lead more calls. That way, there's no confusion. So that was it. The solution to him taking my deal was to give him more access to my deals. I see, I said. Good, he replied. I knew you would. After the call ended, I sat there for a minute, staring at the empty screen. My calendar reminder popped up for the next meeting, but I ignored it. My chest felt tight, like I'd swallowed something that wouldn't go down. That afternoon, an email went out from Dan to the sales org announcing a new collaborative approach to enterprise deals. It talked about shared ownership, leadership involvement, and aligning incentives. It didn't change the written policy. It just reframed expectations. People replied with sounds great and love this. I didn't reply. 2 days later, Dan joined a call I'd scheduled with another prospect, uninvited. He jumped in halfway through, took over the conversation, and promised a custom integration I hadn't discussed. Afterward, he messaged me privately. See how much smoother that went? I didn't answer. The pattern repeated. He inserted himself more, rewrote follow-up emails before I could send them, corrected me in Slack channels. Each instance was small enough to seem reasonable on its own. Together, they formed something else. Then came the performance note. It was titled Coaching Feedback and appeared in my inbox on Friday afternoon. It cited communication style and emotional responses to compensation outcomes. It referenced the HR meeting. It did not mention my numbers, which were still above target. I forwarded it to my personal email. I went to HR again the following week, this time asking for clarification on the coaching note. Megan met with me in a glass-walled room. She smiled tightly. This is developmental, she said, not punitive. It feels punitive. She tilted her head. That's your perception. I want to respond in writing. That may not be necessary, she said. We don't want to escalate. There's that word again, I said. She didn't smile this time. I need you to be careful, she said. Your manager has raised concerns. About what? About your tone. I laughed once before I could stop myself. My tone? Yes, she said. You tend to challenge decisions. I thought we valued transparency. We value respect, she replied, and sometimes that means trusting leadership. I left her office feeling smaller than when I'd walked in. Not defeated, not yet, but aware, in a new way, of the terrain. That night, I opened the folder on my desktop again. I added the coaching note. I added notes from the one-on-one, written as close to verbatim as I could remember. I dated everything. I wasn't fighting over one commission anymore. I was watching the story about me change in real time, written by people with more authority, and I could see exactly where it was heading. For the first time, I wondered if staying quiet was what they wanted all along. The escalation didn't come as a blow-up. It came as procedure. The following Monday, my access to the commission dashboard was restricted. Not removed completely, just limited. I could see my total year-to-date number, but not the line item breakdown anymore. When I clicked into past deals, the page loaded halfway and then refreshed. I tried a different browser. Same thing. I sent a message to Sales Ops asking if there was an outage. They replied 20 minutes later. Per management request, access has been adjusted. Let us know if you have questions. I stared at that sentence longer than I should have. Management request. Singular or plural. It didn't matter. I knew where it came from. I forwarded the message to my personal email and took a screenshot of the error screen. I was starting to do that automatically, without thinking. Capture, save, move on. That afternoon, Dan called a team meeting. No agenda. Cameras optional. He talked about maturity and how senior sellers handle adversity. He didn't mention names, but he looked directly at my square when he said, "We don't litigate every outcome." I kept my camera on and my face still. I took notes, even though there was nothing to write down. After the meeting, he sent me a private message. "Hope that was helpful." I didn't reply. The next change was my accounts. 2 of my larger prospects were reassigned temporarily while Dan provided coverage. One was moved to him directly. The other went to a newer rep with Dan CC'd on every email. I asked him about it in Slack. He suggested we talk live. On the call, he was cheerful. Almost warm. "I want to take some pressure off you," he said. "You've had a lot going on." I didn't ask for accounts to be removed. "I know," he said. This is about balance." "Balance between who?" "Between performance and professionalism," he replied. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "My performance hasn't dropped." "No," he agreed, "but the risk profile has changed." "What does that mean?" "It means leadership is watching," he said, "and they're concerned." "Concerned about what?" He hesitated. "Your ability to align with decisions." I wrote that phrase down after the call. Ability to align with decisions. It sounded clinical, accessible. That same week, HR rolled out an anonymous pulse survey. One of the questions asked whether employees felt comfortable raising concerns about compensation. I almost laughed when I read it. I selected strongly disagree. 2 days later, Megan emailed me asking if I had a few minutes to talk about engagement feedback. I declined and asked to keep communication in writing. She didn't respond. Then the calendar invite arrived. Performance improvement discussion. 30 minutes. Dan and HR. Mandatory. I slept badly the night before. Not from panic, exactly, but from the constant low-level alert I'd been living in. Every email felt loaded. Every Slack notification made my shoulders tighten. The meeting started on time. Megan was there again, same notebook, same pen. Dan had his camera on this time. He looked composed, almost bored. "This isn't a PIP," Megan said quickly. "We want to be clear about that." "But it is a documented conversation," Dan added. They went through a slide deck, 3 bullet points: communication style, emotional regulation, trust in leadership. None of it referenced sales numbers. None of it referenced the Acorn deal directly. It was all framed as concern for my trajectory. "You're a strong sales contributor," Megan said, "which is why this matters." "I want to respond to this in writing," I said. Dan frowned. "That's not necessary." "I'm going to anyway." Megan clicked her pen. "We'd advise against being defensive." "I'm being precise." Dan leaned forward. "This is exactly what we're talking about." I felt my face heat again, but I kept my voice even. "You took my commission. Since then, my access has been limited, my accounts reassigned, and my behavior reframed as a problem. I want that acknowledged." There was a pause. Megan looked at Dan. Dan looked back at her. "We're not going to relitigate past decisions," Megan said, "and I need you to lower your voice." "I'm not raising it," I said. She pressed her lips together. "This is bordering on insubordination." That word landed hard. Insubordination, as if this were a chain of command issue, not a pay dispute. "I'm asking for documentation," I said. "That's all." "We'll send a summary," she replied. After the call, my company email access flickered, just for a second. Long enough for my inbox to reload. It came back, but the message was clear. They could touch things I needed without warning. That evening, I got a text from Laura, the coworker James had mentioned before. We weren't close, but we'd worked on a few deals together. "Hey," she wrote, "random question. Did Dan ever take credit for one of your deals?" I stared at the screen, then typed back. "Yes." A minute passed. Then, "He did it to me last year. Smaller amount. HR told me it was a misunderstanding." "Did you push back?" "No," she said. "They made it sound like I was being difficult." I put the phone down and sat on the edge of my bed. The room was quiet. I could hear traffic outside, someone laughing on the sidewalk. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a pattern. The next morning, I noticed something else. My internal profile, used for recognition and promotions, had been updated. A sentence had been added under manager feedback, working on navigating feedback with openness. I hadn't been notified. I took another screenshot. By Friday, my pipeline looked different, thinner. Not because deals had fallen through, but because they were no longer mine. Dan framed it as redistribution. HR framed it as support. Leadership framed it as alignment. No one framed it as retaliation. But that's what it felt like. Quiet, procedural, deniable. Each step small enough to explain away, but together forming a clear message. Stop talking, or this gets worse. I started drafting a timeline that night. Not emotional, just dates, times, actions. I included who was present, what was said, what changed afterward. It stretched longer than I expected. I didn't know yet who would see it. I only knew I wasn't imagining things anymore. They weren't just taking money. They were taking ground. The proof came from a place I hadn't expected, and at a time when I was almost too tired to recognize it for what it was. It was a Thursday afternoon, quiet in the office because half the floor was at an offsite. I was packing up early, planning to work from home the next day when I got a Slack message from Sales Ops. Not a direct message, an automated notification that a report I'd requested earlier was ready. The report was mislabeled. Instead of my name, it had Dan's. That's why it went through. I almost ignored it, almost closed my laptop and left, but something made me click. It was a full commission attribution export. Every deal for the quarter. Names, percentages, notes, internal-only fields that weren't visible on the dashboard. I scrolled slowly, my finger tight on the trackpad. There it was. Acorn Manufacturing. Originator, me. Closing manager, Dan. Attribution, override, yes. Override, reason. Manager led close due to rep communication concerns. I stared at that line until the words blurred. There was a timestamp. The override had been entered 2 days after the deal closed. Entered by Dan. Approved by... There was a second field I hadn't known existed. HR business partner, Megan. I didn't move for a full minute. I could hear the air conditioner clicking on and off. Someone laughed down the hall. The office smelled like cleaning spray. This wasn't interpretation. This wasn't perception. It wasn't subjective language or cultural framing. It was a documented override. With a reason. And that reason was false. I scrolled further. There were notes attached. Short, clinical. Rep displayed resistance to leadership involvement. Decision made to ensure deal success. I had never resisted involvement. I had followed process. I had documentation for every step. I took screenshots of everything. Not just the Acorn line, but the metadata, the timestamps, the approval chain. I saved the file in 3 places. My desktop, a USB drive I kept in my bag, and my personal cloud storage. Then I closed my laptop and left. I didn't go home right away. I sat in my car in the parking garage, engine off, phone on my lap. My hands were steady, which surprised me. I felt clear, focused. That night, I added the report to my timeline. I highlighted the override reason and cross-referenced it with emails and Slack messages from the same dates. There was nothing in them that supported the claim. No warning. No coaching note before the override. No record of concern until after the money changed hands. The next morning, I emailed Megan. I kept it short. No accusations. No emotion. I received documentation showing a commission attribution override on the Acorn deal. The stated reason references rep communication concerns prior to the override. Please provide any documentation supporting that rationale. I CC'd my personal email. She replied 3 hours later. Happy to discuss live. I wrote back. I'm requesting documentation in writing. No response. At 4:47 p.m., Dan sent me a calendar invite for the following Monday. Subject, reset conversation. HR included. I didn't accept it. Instead, I forwarded the commission report to an external employment attorney I'd found the night before. I included my timeline. I didn't editorialize. I just attached files. The attorney replied the next day. This is significant, she wrote. Do not attend any further meetings without representation or written agenda. Preserve everything. That word, significant, settled something in me. On Monday morning, before the meeting time, my email access was suspended. It wasn't total. I could still log in, but outgoing messages failed. Drafts wouldn't send. An IT notice popped up saying there was an account sync issue. Dan messaged me on Slack. HR is concerned you're being uncooperative. I'm waiting for documentation, I replied. Let's talk, he wrote. No, I said. Not without agenda. 10 minutes later, Megan emailed my personal account. We're noticing disengagement, she wrote. Avoiding meetings can be viewed as insubordination. I replied once. I have documentation showing HR approved commission override based on false rationale. I've requested supporting records. Please provide them. She didn't respond. By Tuesday, the tone shifted. I received a formal letter via DocuSign. Notice of performance improvement plan. Effective immediately. Duration, 30 days. Goals. Demonstrate trust in leadership. Improve communication tone. Reduce escalations. There was a section at the bottom for my signature. I didn't sign it. Instead, my attorney sent a letter that afternoon. It referenced the commission report, the override reason, the approval chain. It asked why HR approved a compensation change based on alleged conduct that had not been documented, communicated, or addressed prior to the payout. It also asked why access and accounts were modified following my complaint. HR replied the next day, not to me, but to my attorney. They called it an administrative adjustment. They said the override reason was poorly worded. They said there was no retaliation, only business alignment. They did not deny the facts. That was the moment it became undeniable, not just to me, but on paper, in writing, with witnesses. By the end of the week, Dan stopped messaging me altogether. My Slack access was limited to direct messages only. I was removed from team channels. I sat at my desk, technically still employed, with nothing to do. No accounts, no meetings, no pipeline. On Friday at 3:12 p.m., Megan emailed my personal account again. We'd like to discuss a separation package. I forwarded it to my attorney and shut my laptop. For weeks, they had told me to be quiet, to lower my voice, to trust leadership, to align. Now they weren't asking me to be quiet anymore. They were trying to make me go away. And this time, I had proof. Once the separation conversation was on the table, everything slowed down in a strange way. The urgency they'd shown before, meetings, notes, warnings, evaporated. No one needed anything from me anymore. I was still on payroll, still technically an employee, but the days stretched out, empty and tense. I worked from home that week, not because they told me to, but because there was no point going in. My badge still worked. But my calendar was blank. I logged on every morning at 8:30 out of habit, opened my laptop, and stared at the screen. Slack was quiet. Email was quieter. The silence gave my thoughts too much room. I kept replaying the HR meeting in my head. Not the big moments, the commission, the override, but the small ones. Megan telling me to be quiet. The way she'd said it without hesitation, like it was an appropriate thing to say to an adult professional. The way Dan had leaned back, afterward, comfortable, certain. I'd always thought of myself as steady, not reactive. The kind of person who handled conflict by being prepared, by bringing facts. Watching that fail so completely did something to me. It made me question instincts I'd trusted for years. At night, I slept lightly. I'd wake up at 3 or 4 a.m. with my heart racing, convinced I'd missed an email or a deadline, even though there were none. I started checking my phone compulsively, scrolling through old messages, rereading threads, as if new meaning might appear. My attorney called midweek to go over next steps. Her voice was calm, almost soothing. She talked about leverage, documentation, timelines. I listened and took notes, but it felt like she was talking about someone else, a version of me who wasn't sitting on the couch in sweatpants, staring at a blank wall. After the call, I cried. Not loudly, just quietly, sitting there. It surprised me how quickly it came. I wasn't crying about the money, not exactly. I was crying because something I'd invested so much of myself in had turned hostile without warning, and because the people who did it had made me feel unreasonable for noticing. My sister noticed something was off when we talked that night. She asked how work was going, casually, the way she always did. "It's complicated," I said. She waited. I filled the silence with details I'd rehearsed but never said out loud. The override, HR, the PIP, the separation email. "That's retaliation," she said immediately. "I know," I said, "but hearing it from someone else helps." "Are you okay?" she asked. I hesitated. "I don't know yet." The next day, HR sent over a proposed separation agreement. Severance equal to 6 weeks' pay. No commission. A standard non-disparagement clause. A release of claims. Reading it made my chest tighten. It was written as if nothing unusual had happened, as if this were a mutual, respectful parting. There was no mention of Acorn, no acknowledgement of, the override. Just language about performance fit and future success. I sent it to my attorney. She replied with tracked changes and a note. "They're lowballing." Even so, seeing my job reduced to a document with checkboxes and legal language hurt more than I expected. I'd given them weekends, late nights, missed dinners. I'd hit numbers that were used in investor decks, and now it was being wrapped up like a loose end. I started doubting myself in quieter ways. Not about the facts. I knew those were solid. But about my reactions. Had I pushed too hard? Should I have let the first meeting go? Should I have smiled more, nodded more, played along? Those thoughts crept in when I was tired, when the apartment was too quiet. They were insidious. They sounded reasonable. They sounded like advice. One afternoon, I opened the folder on my desktop again and scrolled through everything from the beginning. The deal timeline, the policy, the override report, the coaching note dated after the payout. The screenshots of Slack messages congratulating Dan for my deal. Seeing it all together grounded me. The order of events mattered. The cause and effect were clear. This wasn't me being sensitive. This was them covering themselves. Still, the emotional fallout lingered. I found myself flinching at notifications, even personal ones. A text from a friend asking how I was doing made me defensive, like I needed to justify something. I realized how much of my identity had been tied to being competent, respected, unproblematic. Now I'd been labeled the opposite. Dan didn't reach out again. Not once. No explanation, no attempt to soften the landing. The last time I saw his name was on the commission report, next to the money that should have been mine. Megan emailed once more, asking if I'd had a chance to review the agreement. Her tone was polite, neutral, as if the previous months hadn't happened, as if she hadn't approved the override that set everything in motion. I didn't reply right away. Instead, I went for a long walk. No music, just the sound of my shoes on the pavement. I noticed things I usually ignored, the way the air smelled like rain, the way people moved with purpose, heading somewhere they still belonged. By the time I got home, I felt steadier. Not calm, exactly, but resolved. I emailed my attorney and told her I wanted to counter. Not aggressively, just firmly. Commission included, neutral reference, removal of the PIP from my file. She replied with a simple, "Okay." That night, I slept for almost 8 hours straight, the first time in weeks. The fallout wasn't over. I knew that. There were still conversations to be had, decisions to make. But something had shifted internally. I stopped trying to figure out how to make them see me differently. They'd already decided who I was. What I needed to decide now was who I was going to be once this was done. The external consequences started showing up before anything was finalized. 2 days after my attorney sent the counter, I was locked out completely. No email, no Slack, no CRM. When I tried to log in, I got a generic IT message about access being disabled. No warning, no explanation, just gone. An hour later, a courier showed up at my apartment building with a prepaid box and instructions to return company equipment within 48 hours. The email explaining it went to my personal account. "Standard offboarding procedure," it said. I forwarded it to my attorney. She replied almost immediately. "They're escalating pressure. Document everything." I packed the laptop and badge carefully, like they were fragile. I included a note listing what I was returning, took photos of the contents, and dropped the box off the same day. I kept the receipt. That afternoon, my health insurance portal stopped loading. I called the provider and was told my coverage had been marked as pending termination. The date listed was the end of the month, still 2 weeks away, but the status had already changed. I felt a flash of panic then, sharp and physical. I had a prescription I refilled monthly. I made a note to do it early. My attorney sent a follow-up letter pointing out the lockout and the insurance issue. HR responded the next morning, apologetic in tone, blaming a system trigger. They said access would be restored if necessary. It wasn't restored. Meanwhile, word started getting around internally. Former coworkers texted me in ones and twos, careful with their language. Hey, hope you're okay. Heard things got complicated. Let me know if you want to grab coffee sometime. No one asked directly what happened. No one offered to speak up. I didn't blame them. I could see the shape of the warning in every message. James was the only one who called. They're saying you're on a PIP, he said quietly, and that you refused to cooperate. I asked for documentation, I said. Yeah, he replied. I figured. He paused. Dan's been telling leadership he had to step in because you were difficult. I closed my eyes. Of course he is. I'm sorry, James said. I just wanted you to know. After we hung up, I added his call to my timeline. Date, time, summary. I'd stopped doing it for emotional reasons. Now it was just habit. The counteroffer came back that Friday. They'd increased the severance slightly, 8 weeks instead of 6. Still no commission, still a full release of claims, still a non-disparagement clause that went one way only. They refused to remove the PIP language from my file. They said it was historical. My attorney walked me through it line by line over the phone. She was calm, methodical. They're betting you want this over, she said. They're also trying to protect Dan and HR. What happens if I don't sign? We can escalate, she said. Formal demand, potential, complaint. But it will take time. Time meant stress. It meant uncertainty. It meant becoming a problem they'd label louder. I asked her what she'd do if it were her. She didn't answer right away. You're in a strong position factually, she said, but emotionally, this process takes a toll. I knew that already. While all this was happening, recruiters started reaching out, quietly. One said they'd heard I was open to new opportunities. Another asked if I was still at my company, phrasing it like a question. Someone had talked. I took 2 calls. Both went well until the end, when they asked why I was leaving. I kept it neutral. Role change, cultural mismatch. One recruiter nodded. The other hesitated. Your manager's name came up, she said carefully. He's well known. That landed harder than I expected. He is? I asked. She smiled thinly. Let's just say people talk. The implication was clear. This wasn't contained. Whatever narrative Dan and HR were pushing had leaked outward, just enough to color me without leaving fingerprints. By the end of the second week, my access to internal job postings was gone. My profile disappeared from the company directory, not officially terminated, but erased in practice. HR emailed again, asking me to confirm my last working day. I replied through my attorney. She sent a more aggressive response this time. It cited retaliation statutes. It referenced the lockout, the insurance change, the override report. It asked for commission payment as part of settlement. The reply came from legal, not HR. It was longer, colder. It denied wrongdoing. It said any further communication should go through counsel. It included a revised agreement with a new clause about confidentiality of internal processes. They were closing ranks. That night, I went through my LinkedIn profile and updated it quietly. I didn't mark myself as open. I just changed my role to past tense. Within hours, Dan viewed my profile. I stared at the notification, feeling something like disbelief. He hadn't spoken to me in weeks, but he was watching. A few days later, Laura texted me again. I just wanted you to know, she wrote. They changed the commission policy. Changed how? Overrides now require VP approval, she said, and HR can't approve attribution alone. I read the message twice. So it wasn't always like that, I typed. No, she replied. This is new. I sat with that for a long time. They'd fixed the process, quietly, without acknowledging the harm, without undoing what they'd done to me. That was the external shape of it all. Policy tweaks, controlled exits, carefully worded agreements, reputations nudged just enough to tilt future conversations. No apology, no accountability, just containment. By the end of the month, my termination date was set. I still hadn't signed anything. My attorney said we could keep negotiating. But I could hear the fatigue in her voice now, too. The consequences had spread beyond the building, beyond the deal, beyond the commission. They'd followed me into conversations I wasn't part of, into systems I couldn't see. I wasn't just leaving a job, I was being pushed out of a version of my career that assumed fairness was enforceable if you stayed calm and brought receipts. That assumption was gone. What replaced it wasn't anger, it was clarity. Once the noise died down, the internal part started. The emails slowed, the calls stopped. My attorney handled most of the communication now, forwarding me summaries instead of threads. There was nothing left for me to do except wait and think, which turned out to be the hardest part. I didn't realize how much of my daily structure had been tied to work until it was gone. Not just the schedule, but the small validations. The sense of momentum, the certainty that if I did things the right way, documented, calmly, professionally, it would count for something. Without that, my days felt oddly hollow. I woke up early anyway, out of habit, then lay there staring at the ceiling. I'd replay conversations in my head while making coffee, mentally rewriting sentences, imagining different outcomes. It was pointless, but I couldn't stop. I noticed a change in how I spoke to people. I started qualifying everything. Maybe I'm wrong, but this might not be a big deal, even with friends, even with my sister. It was like I'd internalized the idea that asserting myself too clearly was dangerous. At the grocery store one afternoon, someone cut in front of me in line. I felt the irritation flare, then immediately tamped it down. It wasn't worth it. That thought came automatically now. Not worth it. Don't escalate. That was new. I'd always thought of myself as measured, not passive. Now I wasn't sure where the line was anymore. Some nights, I dreamed about the office. Not dramatic. Dreams. Mundane ones. I'd be sitting at my desk trying to log in, watching the screen refresh over and over. Or I'd be in a meeting, opening my mouth to speak and realizing no sound was coming out. I'd wake up with my heart racing, my jaw clenched. During the day, I avoided thinking about what I'd say in interviews. The idea of explaining why I left made my stomach tighten. I worried about how I'd sound. Defensive, bitter, complicated, none of those things were allowed. I caught myself rehearsing answers in my head, then discarding them. Too honest, too vague, too risky. What bothered me most wasn't that they'd taken the commission. It was that they'd taken something more subtle, my trust in my own perception. They'd reframed facts as tone problems, documentation as aggression, persistence as misalignment. And it had worked, at least enough to make me hesitate now. I'd always believed that workplaces had rules you could rely on if you understood them well enough. Policies, processes, escalation paths. Seeing how easily those could be bent or rewritten after the fact made me feel naive in a way I hadn't before. I started noticing similar dynamics everywhere, in news stories, in conversations with friends about their jobs, who had power, who defined what was reasonable, who got labeled difficult. Once you see it, it's hard to unsee. I also felt a strange guilt, even though I knew I shouldn't. Guilt for involving a lawyer, guilt for not just letting it go, guilt for the stress my sister worried about when she checked in on me, guilt for the coworkers who texted in hushed tones, clearly afraid. It was like I'd violated an unspoken rule. You can be wronged, but you can't insist on naming it. One afternoon, I opened the separation agreement again, even though nothing had changed. I read it slowly, line by line, noticing how impersonal it was, how carefully it avoided specifics, how it reduced months of conflict to a few neutral phrases. I imagined signing it. Imagined the relief of being done, of not having to think about Dan, or HR, or commission reports ever again. Then I imagined what it would feel like later, knowing I had accepted their version of events in exchange for quiet. That image stuck with me. I wasn't angry all the time. That surprised me too. The anger came in flashes, sharp and brief, usually triggered by something small. A LinkedIn post about values, a podcast clip about leadership, a memory of Megan's voice telling me to be quiet. Mostly, I felt tired. Tired of monitoring myself, tired of explaining less than the truth, tired of carrying this thing that had no clean ending. I started journaling, not about the case, but about how I felt in my body. Tight chest, shallow breathing, jaw pain. I realized how long I'd been bracing myself, waiting for the next email, the next shift in tone. When there were no more emails, the tension didn't disappear. It just had nowhere to go. One evening, I ran into an old colleague from a different company while walking my neighborhood. We chatted briefly, catching up in the vague way people do. She asked what I was up to now. I'm between roles, I said. She nodded. That can be a weird space. It is, I agreed. She didn't ask why. I was grateful for that. After we parted, I realized how much I appreciated not having to justify myself in that moment. Not having to package the story. It made me wonder how much energy I'd been spending trying to be understood by people who had no incentive to understand me. That realization landed quietly, but firmly. I began to see that what I was grieving wasn't just a job. It was an idea I'd held about how systems worked, about fairness being something you could access if you were articulate and calm and prepared. Losing that belief felt like losing a layer of skin. Everything felt closer, sharper, but also clearer. I stopped checking Dan's LinkedIn profile. I stopped rereading old Slack messages. I trusted my timeline enough to let it sit untouched for a few days. When my attorney emailed with another update, still negotiating, still slow, I read it without the familiar spike of adrenaline. It mattered. But it didn't consume me the way it had. That felt like progress, even if I couldn't quite explain why. I didn't know yet what I was going to do. Sign, fight, walk away. All of those options were still open. What had changed was something internal and irreversible. I no longer needed them to validate what had happened. I believed myself again. The decision didn't come in a dramatic moment. There was no final email, no raised voice, no sudden clarity. It came on a Tuesday morning while I was sitting at my kitchen table staring at the separation agreement for what felt like the 100th time. I noticed something I hadn't before. The agreement was dated 2 weeks earlier. They'd already decided how this would end. The back and forth, the revisions, the slightly improved severance, it was all just negotiation theater layered on top of a conclusion they'd reached without me. That was the moment I stopped feeling like I was choosing between options and started feeling like I was choosing how much of myself I was willing to leave behind. I called my attorney and asked her a direct question. If I sign this, what happens next? She didn't sugarcoat it. You get paid, you walk away, you don't talk about it. They move on. And if I don't? There's risk, she said. Time, stress, but also leverage. You don't give them closure on their terms. After we hung up, I sat there for a long time. The apartment was quiet. Sunlight came through the window and landed on the table right over the signature line. I thought about the months leading up to Acorn, the weekends I'd worked, the trust I'd placed in people because that's what you're told to do if you want to be seen as professional. I thought about how quickly that trust had been reframed as a weakness once it was inconvenient. I also thought about what signing would mean, not just legally, but internally. It would mean agreeing in some small but real way that the way they'd treated me was acceptable, that the money mattered more than the truth, that quiet was the price of moving on. I wasn't sure I could carry that forward without it showing up everywhere else. That afternoon, I emailed my attorney and told her I wasn't signing the current version. I asked her to prepare a final counter, commission included, mutual non-disparagement, removal of internal performance language, or we proceed formally. She replied with a single line, "Understood." The response from their legal team took longer this time, almost a week. I didn't spend that week obsessing the way I would have before. I went on long walks. I met my sister for lunch. I cleaned out my closet. I let myself imagine what my days might look like without this hanging over me. When the reply finally came, it was blunt. They would not pay the commission. They would not remove the PIP language. They were willing to slightly increase severance again, but only if I signed within 48 hours. Otherwise, they would consider the offer withdrawn. It was an ultimatum. Clean, clear. I read it once. Then again. And for the first time since this started, I felt calm. I called my attorney and told her I was done negotiating. "Are you sure?" she asked. "This is the last offer." "I know," I said. "I'm not signing." She paused. "Okay," she said finally. "Then we proceed." Proceed meant filing a formal complaint. It meant time. It meant uncertainty. It meant that this wouldn't be a neat story with a quiet ending. But it also meant I wasn't agreeing to disappear. Once that decision was made, something loosened in me. The tension I'd been carrying for weeks eased, just a little. Didn't feel victorious or righteous. I felt settled. That night, I slept deeply. The next steps unfolded slowly. My attorney filed the paperwork. Notices were sent. Deadlines were set. Everything moved at the pace of institutions, not people. I stopped checking my email constantly. I stopped waiting for something to drop. There was nothing more I needed to decide. A few days later, I got a message from James. "Just heard you officially left," and he wrote, "I'm sorry how it all went down." "Thank you," I replied. He hesitated, then sent another message. "For what it's worth, a few of us know what really happened." I stared at that for a moment. It would have meant everything to me once. Now it just felt nice, human. "I appreciate that," I wrote back. "Take care of yourself." That was it. No long explanation, no warning, no request. I realized I didn't need witnesses anymore. I needed distance. I updated my resume, slowly, deliberately. I removed the language I'd once used to sound impressive and replaced it with specifics. Real numbers, real work. I didn't include Dan as a reference. When recruiters asked why I left, I tested different versions of the truth. I found one that felt right, not defensive, not evasive, just clear. There was a compensation dispute that revealed misalignment in values, I said. I chose not to stay. Most people accepted that without pressing. The ones who didn't weren't people I wanted to work for anyway. The complaint process was ongoing, but it no longer defined my days. It existed alongside my life instead of consuming it. One afternoon, while organizing old files, I found the very first screenshot I'd taken, the payout report with the empty commission line. I looked at it for a long time. That image had once made my stomach drop. Now it just looked like evidence, part of a record, something finished. I didn't know how the case would end. I still don't. Outcomes are unpredictable. Institutions protect themselves. I'm realistic about that. But I know this. I didn't let them rewrite what happened. I didn't let their version be the only one that existed. Choosing not to sign wasn't about revenge or principle in the abstract. It was about not training myself to accept being erased in exchange for convenience. I lost money. I lost a job. I lost a sense of safety I might not fully get back. What I didn't lose was the ability to say, plainly and without apology, that something wrong happened, and that I wasn't going to be quiet about it just to make it easier for everyone else. That decision, once made, felt permanent. Whatever came next would build on that. The aftermath didn't arrive all at once. It unfolded in pieces, uneven and unsatisfying in the way real endings usually are. 3 months after I officially left, my attorney called with an update. The complaint had moved forward. The company had responded through counsel, denying retaliation, acknowledging process improvements, and asserting that the commission decision fell within managerial discretion. There would be mediation before anything else. I listened, took notes, asked a few questions. When the call ended, I didn't feel much of anything. No surge of hope, no dread, just a quiet acknowledgement that this was still happening and that I was still separate from it. By then, I had started a new job. It wasn't a dramatic upgrade or a symbolic win. It was a smaller company, less polished, fewer layers. During the interview process, I asked direct questions about commission attribution. I didn't hedge. I didn't soften it. I asked how disputes were handled and who had final say. The CEO answered himself. "If someone sells it, it's theirs," he said. "If we screw that up, we fix it." That was enough for me. The first few weeks at the new job were strange. I kept waiting for something to go wrong, for a meeting to turn sideways, for a neutral comment to hide a warning. When nothing happened, I realized how deeply I'd internalized the old environment. I spoke less at first, listened more than I needed to. It took time to trust that disagreement wouldn't be framed as a flaw. At night, though, the old job still surfaced. Not every night, but often enough. I'd wake up thinking about the override note, the phrase communication concerns. How easily it had been typed, how heavy it had become. Eventually, those thoughts lost their edge. They stopped demanding my attention. They became something I could notice and then set aside. The mediation happened on a Thursday morning. I didn't attend. My attorney handled it. I spent the day working, intentionally keeping my calendar full. That afternoon, she emailed me a summary. The company agreed to a confidential settlement, not everything I'd asked for, not the full commission. But more than they'd offered before. A neutral reference, a clause acknowledging that no performance-based termination had occurred. No apology. I read the email twice, then once more. "Do you want to accept?" she asked. I thought about it overnight, not because I was torn, but because I wanted to be sure I was deciding from the right place. Not exhaustion, not fear, not a need for closure they'd defined. The next morning, I wrote back, "Yes." Signing that agreement felt different from how I'd imagined it months earlier. It didn't feel like surrender. It felt like punctuation. The money arrived 2 weeks later. I paid off the credit card. I moved apartments. Life absorbed it the way life absorbs most things. Quietly, without ceremony. Dan's name hasn't come up since. Neither has Megan's. I don't look them up. I don't need to. Occasionally, someone from the old company reaches out. Usually carefully. Sometimes to ask how I'm doing. Once to ask if I'd consider coming back in a different role. I said no. Not because I'm angry. Because I know what that environment taught me, and I don't need a refresher. The biggest change has been internal, and it's subtle enough that I didn't notice it at first. I don't rush to soften my words anymore. I don't preemptively apologize for being clear. When something doesn't sit right, I name it early, before it calcifies into something harder to address. That doesn't mean every conversation goes well. It doesn't mean I'm immune to doubt. It just means I trust my read on situations again. I also understand now that systems don't feel pressure. People do. And when pressure shows up, character does too. Sometimes I think back to that first HR meeting, to the exact moment Megan told me to be quiet, to how strange it felt, how out of place. I remember sitting there, knowing something was wrong, but not yet understanding how far it would go. If I could speak to that version of myself, I wouldn't tell them to do anything differently. I wouldn't tell them to fight harder or walk away sooner. I'd just tell them this. You're not imagining it, and you're not wrong for noticing. The rest unfolds the way it does. I still believe in doing good work. I still believe in preparation and documentation. I just don't believe those things protect you on their own. They're tools, not shields. What protects you is knowing when to stop asking for permission to be taken seriously. The story didn't end with a dramatic victory or a public reckoning. It ended with me continuing on, a little changed, a little clearer, and no longer willing to be quiet just because someone in power found my voice inconvenient. That turned out to be enough.